A big question tonight: was the lost colony really lost? Tales of the first English settlers disappearing from Roanoke Island have been shared for nearly a century, but now a new twist in a very old story.
For more than 4 centuries, the Roanoke Colony was treated as America's first great disappearing act.
It is one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries, and it happened in our own backyard.
A settlement that simply evaporated, leaving only a single carved word behind.
Leave a secret token, as he called it, behind, so that he would know where to find it. And this seemed to be the answer. Here was Croatoan carved onto the post.
But in 2025, scientists uncovered evidence that finally breaks the silence.
Well, that's right. The leaders of this team say what they've found is very exciting and very convincing.
The mystery wasn't a massacre or a myth, it was a trail.
We had found dead bodies scattered or obvious signs of a siege or an attack. That would be the answer that we need.
And now, for the first time, we can finally follow it. John White. The plan, at least on paper, was crystal clear. England wanted a foothold in America. They wanted a place where families could live, farm, pray, and claim land in the name of the crown. But Roanoke wasn't supposed to be the destination at all. The colony had always been meant for the Chesapeake Bay, a far safer and more fertile region. But their pilot, Simon Fernandez, overruled those plans. Known for being hot-tempered and impulsive, Fernandez had a reputation for ignoring orders and acting on his own. John White later admitted that Fernandez constantly defied his authority during the trip. When they neared the Carolina coast, Fernandez refused to sail further north. He claimed that the Atlantic hurricane season had already begun, and that Spanish patrol ships were swarming the entrance to Chesapeake Bay. To risk his vessel in those conditions, he argued, was suicide. So instead, he dumped the settlers at Roanoke, hundreds of miles from their planned destination, and sailed away. His priority was not the colony's success. It was keeping his ship out of Spanish hands. From 1587 to 1589, Roanoke experienced the worst drought in 800 years. Even established native tribes struggled to feed their own people. For the Roanoke settlers, already low on supplies, starvation became inevitable. But what they faced was much more than hunger. 2 years before this new colony arrived, an earlier English military group led by Ralph Lane had burned villages, kidnapped leaders, and killed the influential Chief Wingina. Every tribe in the region remembered this violence. So the 1,587 colonists walked into a land that was already full of suspicion. Some tribes remained cautious but peaceful, like the Croatan. Unlike other groups, they didn't immediately reject or resist the new settlers. Their territory had also escaped some of the earlier violence. This gave them a more neutral position, at least at first. But even the Croatan weren't fully trusting. They were just more open to negotiation. Other tribes refused contact entirely. So, a massive tension already existed long before John White stepped onto the island. Still, the Roanoke settlers tried. They repaired the old fort. They planted where they could. They negotiated small agreements with neighboring tribes. For a moment, it looked possible, until reality set in and food and supplies ran out. The colonists made the decision that would haunt history. They sent John White, their governor, back to England for help. He expected to return by spring. Instead, war erupted. Spain launched the Armada. Every English ship capable of sailing was seized for national defense. John White begged for passage, but he was denied again and again. He watched helplessly as the months stretched into 3 years. When he finally returned to Roanoke in August of 1590, the island was disturbingly quiet. Everything looked abandoned. It looked like a place people had walked away from deliberately. Then White saw the clue that launched 400 years of obsession. Carved into a sturdy wooden post was a single word. And nearby, carved into a tree, 3 incomplete letters. CRO. White immediately recognized the code. Before he left, the settlers had agreed on a plan. If they were forced to move, they would carve the name of their new location. If they were in danger, they would add a cross. There was no cross. There was only the name of an island south of Roanoke, home to the Croatan tribe, the only group still friendly to the English after the earlier military violence. John White truly believed the colony had relocated. He believed he was close. But unfortunately, nature intervened again. A violent storm slammed into his ship, which caused the anchor to snap. The crew refused to continue. John White was forced back to England, and he never made it back to America. He died never knowing what became of his family, or what happened to the Roanoke Colony. To understand what really happened to Roanoke, we need to look at what came after, because the real trail began with the rumors. Strange reports, stranger people. For a moment, it seemed like Roanoke had died in silence. But as the decades rolled forward, unsettling stories began to slip through the cracks. When Jamestown was founded in 1607, the colonists expected danger, hunger, conflict, and the unknown. What they didn't expect were people who looked a little too familiar. Jamestown leaders like William Strachey and John Smith recorded rumors of tribes who claimed their ancestors came from white people who arrived long before the English ever built Jamestown. Some indigenous groups even pointed to villages deep in the Carolina interior, settlements arranged in straight lines with rectangular homes, a layout far closer to English tradition than native architecture. These were reports written by the same men who recorded the founding of Jamestown. Strachey, in one letter, even suggested that some Roanoke survivors had been seen wearing European-style clothing. Whether he believed it himself, he didn't say, but the claim was written down. Even English spies joined in. During the early 1700s, French and English agents fighting for influence in the Southeast reported encountering indigenous groups who used English surnames or claimed to descend from English men. Most historians brushed these accounts aside as confusion or exaggeration. Still, the mystery refused to die. By the time the 1700s turned into the 1800s, Roanoke had become folklore, a story about people who went into the trees and never came back. And then in 1937, a farmer walking near the Chowan River noticed a carved stone half buried in the mud. It carried a message, supposedly written by Eleanor Dare, the daughter of Governor John White and mother of Virginia Dare. The inscription described disease, death, and a desperate plea for anyone to find her final resting place. For a moment, it looked like the case was solved. But then, more stones appeared. Too many. Experts called out some of them for being fake. Yet the Dare stones weren't the only theories rising out of the shadows. Some historians argued the colony fell apart from within. Hunger can turn people dangerous. Drought can turn neighbors into enemies. Others suggested the settlers died from disease that tore through the population faster than they could react. And then there were darker theories, the Spanish slaughtering them in secret raids, tribes retaliating for English violence, or colonists descending into panic and madness. But for all the theories, one thing was missing: evidence. Archaeologists combed Roanoke Island for generations. They uncovered beads, tools, fragments of pottery bits, and pieces of life, but never a trail that led beyond the island. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with every edge missing, until something happened that no one saw coming. A discovery on a map that had been sitting in a museum drawer for centuries. Suddenly, everything we thought we knew about the lost colony shifted with one hidden map found in that drawer. Site X and the secret map. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum were studying a 16th century watercolor map called La Virginia Pars. It was hand-drawn by John White, the same man who sailed back to England for supplies in 1587. His map had always been considered valuable. It was detailed, accurate, one of the best early depictions of the Carolina coastline. But no one had ever noticed what was hiding underneath. A team led by curator Kim Sloan began analyzing the map under ultraviolet light. They weren't looking for secrets, just trying to better preserve the colors. But as the layers of pigment were illuminated, something completely unexpected appeared. It was a four-pointed blue and red star. And it wasn't on the surface. It had been drawn on a small patch of paper glued on top of the map, almost like someone had tried to cover it up. What's more, the star wasn't random. It sat exactly 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, in a location John White had once referenced in his writings. He said that if necessary, the colony would relocate about 50 miles into the interior, a vague phrase historians had long written off as poetic, not literal. But now there was a mark, a deliberate point. This was a plan. Researchers were stunned. The four-pointed star matched military symbols used by the English at the time. It was the kind of mark used to signal a fort or a temporary outpost. That meant White or someone close to him had drawn this symbol to note where the colonists might have gone. They called this new destination Site X. The discovery changed everything. For centuries, the search had focused on Roanoke Island, but now archaeologists had a real place to investigate, a spot on the Albemarle Sound, along the Chowan River near a modern town called Salem Fork. Teams from the First Colony Foundation and researchers from the University of Bristol launched expeditions to the area starting in 2015. They found something: pieces of 16th century pottery, broken European-style dishes, iron tools consistent with English craftsmanship. But most surprisingly, they weren't scattered like trade items. They were concentrated in one area, as if people had lived there for more than a moment. It wasn't enough to say Roanoke was here, but it was more than anyone had found in centuries. Still, there was a problem. Nothing directly tied the site to John White's missing colony. The artifacts could have come from early explorers, or even from trade between tribes and other Europeans who had passed through later. There was no fire pit with a carved Croatoan stone, no bones with British dental work, no collapsed wooden forts. But the location was too precise to ignore. Some researchers believe that Site X was never meant to house the entire colony. It may have been a rendezvous point, a temporary outpost, or even a fallback shelter during harsh winters. Others believe it was a second colony established by splinter groups after internal conflict pushed the settlers to split. The theory is still debated, but one thing is clear: this is the closest we've ever come to real proof. Satellite scans of the area around Site X have since revealed subtle geometric patterns under the soil, possible fence lines, housing grids, and path clearings that match other colonial designs from the late 1500s. Ground-penetrating radar is now being used to explore what might still lie beneath layers of untouched land. There's even a working theory that the colonists at Site X may have eventually moved again, merging with local tribes as tensions or survival needs forced them to adapt. This would explain the unusual genetic markers, gray-eyed children, and European words spotted in tribes like the Lumbee and Hatteras long after Roanoke vanished. But before anyone could prove that, the research hit a wall. Much of the land surrounding Site X is privately owned. Other parts are protected wetlands, and every excavation requires permits, cooperation, and most of all, money. The moment the media buzz faded, so did the resources. But just 2 miles away, another site emerged. And this one raised a whole new possibility. If Site X showed where some of the colonists went, this new place, Site Y, revealed something deeper. Signs that Roanoke's disappearance may not have been a single event, but the start of something far more complex. Site Y and the split colony? 2 miles from Site X, the forest opened up to a second location. Archaeologists started calling it Site Y because no one had expected it. What they found at Site Y didn't match the strict patterns of an English settlement. There were no defensive structures, no layout that screamed colony. But there was something else, something even more revealing. The artifacts weren't just English. They were mixed. Fragments of European ceramics from more than one region, pieces of native-made tools, traces of iron and brass that didn't fit any single cultural source. And these weren't placed for trade or display. They were used, buried in layers of ash and soil that told a story not of visitors, but of living. The implications started to spread through the research team like wildfire. This wasn't just the story of a group that moved. It was the story of a group that split. One part may have gone inland toward Site X, hoping to re-establish the colony further from danger. But another may have chosen a different path entirely. And to understand that, archaeologists had to look back at a place that had always been part of the Roanoke mystery, but never fully taken seriously. An island called Hatteras. Back then it had a different name, Croatoan. The same word carved into the tree. The same island John White had tried to reach in 1590 before the storm forced him back to England. Hatteras had always been part of the story, but only at the edges. That changed when a local historian, Scott Dawson, teamed up with British archaeologist Mark Horton. Together they launched a dig on the island, backed by the Croatoan Archaeological Society. What they uncovered flipped everything. Among the sand and salt-soaked soil, they found the unmistakable remains of English presence. A rusted rapier hilt, gun parts from the Elizabethan era, and most surprisingly, a slate writing tablet, still bearing faint scratches in English script. These were the belongings of settlers. For generations, the Lumbee and Croatan tribes had told stories about the white ancestors, English people who had come to live among them. The stories had always been dismissed by mainstream historians as romanticized legend. But now, the artifacts told the same story. And they weren't alone. Some researchers pointed to linguistic overlaps, unusual English words or phrases woven into the language of nearby tribes. Others began looking at genetic evidence, discovering faint but persistent traces of European ancestry in native communities that predated later colonial contact. Now it's becoming a heavy possibility that the Roanoke settlers didn't all die, and that they were absorbed not in comfort or leave, but out of necessity. Scott Dawson laid out the full case in his 2020 book, The Lost Colony and Hatteras Island. He argued that the colonists facing starvation, abandonment, and fear did the only thing they could. They asked to be taken in. And the Croatan tribe, known to be more open and cooperative than some others, allowed them to stay. This was a surrender to reality. Over time, the settlers would have lost their language, their customs, maybe even their names. They became part of the tribe, and slowly they faded from view because they were absorbed. So now, with Site X, Site Y, and Hatteras Island on the table, a different theory has emerged. The Roanoke Colony didn't vanish. It splintered. One group went inland trying to rebuild, another group went south trying to survive, and both were eventually lost to history. And yet, even this wasn't enough to convince everyone. Because when it comes to archaeology, stories aren't proof no matter how well they fit. The skeptics demanded more, something physical and direct which no one could deny. And in 2025, they finally got it. Ignored tribes. Long before archaeologists uncovered pottery or DNA confirmed a burial, the truth was already being spoken. For over 400 years, several indigenous tribes across North Carolina had carried quiet histories. Stories of settlers who never disappeared because they were taken in. The Lumbee, the Haliwa-Saponi, the Chawanoke, and descendants of the Croatan all passed down versions of the same thing. That white people came into their communities, that they stayed, and that over time the two worlds blurred. These weren't vague legends. They included specific names like dare, physical descriptions like gray eyes or reddish hair, and accounts of language, Old English words still used in places where English settlers were supposedly never present. But for generations, these stories were ignored. When tribal members spoke about their mixed heritage, colonial historians brushed it off as coincidence. They labeled the claims romantic, self-serving, or simply wrong. Oral traditions weren't considered valid unless they matched a written record. And because the Roanoke survivors had left no journal entries, their lives were erased. But these tribes didn't stop remembering. They didn't need a map or a grave to know what happened. They already knew. What makes this remarkable isn't just the accuracy of those stories. It's the consistency across time and distance. The Lumbee tribe, for example, traces its ancestry to both local indigenous people and white settlers, possibly even the Roanoke colonists. Linguists have documented Elizabethan-era English phrases surviving in Lumbee dialect. Words like corn crib and afeard, long faded from modern use, still appeared in oral tradition. And several Lumbee family names like Brayboy and Oxendine have no indigenous origin. They point to English roots. In the early 1900s, a federal agent named Hamilton McMillan took interest in these stories. He interviewed Lumbee elders who told him they were descended from white people who had come a long time ago. He recorded accounts of intermarriage, shared customs, and the slow fading of the colonists into tribal life. McMillan published his findings. They were ignored. In modern genealogical studies, researchers have noted European mitochondrial DNA markers showing up in native populations around Robeson County, again, a region where no known colonial expansion happened until long after Roanoke. It didn't match official history, but it matched the stories. Even the Haliwa-Saponi, whose traditional territory spans across northeastern North Carolina, spoke of strange ancestors, white-skinned, English-speaking, who were absorbed into their bloodlines centuries ago. And on Hatteras Island, descendants of the Croatan people still preserve oral accounts of settlers living among them, building families, and eventually vanishing into the tribe itself. It's one thing to suggest this possibility in theory. It's another to see the consistency of memory across multiple tribes, across generations, all pointing to the same quiet truth. Now, in 2025, science is finally beginning to align with those voices. The pottery, the tools, the DNA, they all echo what the tribe said long ago. And the question is no longer whether we can find the colonists. It's whether we're ready to recognize the people who remembered them. A grave and a woman. It came from one grave, one woman, and one undeniable piece of evidence that would force everyone to rethink what lost really means. The dig site was unremarkable, just a patch of bare earth near the banks of the Chowan River. Cold, quiet, and overlooked even by the researchers who had worked the region for years. But on a February morning in 2025, the team from the First Colony Foundation uncovered something they weren't expecting. Something no one had ever found in over 4 centuries of searching. A grave. At first, it looked like a shallow depression in the soil, nothing more. But as the layers of dirt were peeled back with brushes and gloved hands, the outline became clear. A human skeleton, fully intact. Her body was laid supine. Her arms were folded over her chest with her head facing west and feet facing east. This was a Christian burial, precisely the kind practiced by English settlers, positioned to face the rising sun on Resurrection Day. There were no headstones, just weathered and whole female bones. If this was an English settler and a woman, then everything changed. Because the only documented English presence in this region before 1607 was the Roanoke Colony. And the 1585 expedition, which came before Roanoke, was an all-male military scouting party. They never brought women. Jamestown was founded in 1607, which is nearly 2 decades later, and those settlers never ventured this far inland, at least not officially. This woman was an outlier. When the DNA results came in, they confirmed it. She was of European descent, and her mitochondrial lineage, the maternal DNA passed from mother to child, matched patterns consistent with English ancestry from the late 1500s. This woman had been no lost explorer. She had been buried by people who followed her customs, her rituals, her faith, which means others were there too, and it tied back to everything. The pottery at Site X, the cultural mixing at Site Y, the oral traditions from Croatoan, the hidden map that marked a fort inland. The pieces were part of a larger pattern, one that happened quietly and lasted longer than anyone had dared to imagine. Some colonists may have died early, from disease, exposure, or violence. Others may have fractured into smaller groups, some joining tribes, some going deeper into the wild. That one grave was enough to reopen the entire case as history, proven and preserved in bone. Thanks for watching. Check the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.